Over the next couple of weeks, we're going to explore liberation theology. This is going to include discussion of Latin American liberation theology, Black theology, and feminist theology. But what I want to do today is briefly look at what binds these different movements together. See, in some ways, they're very different. It's also important to note that not all theologians within these camps agree on everything. Whenever we organize theologians into different groups, there's always this risk of unintentionally implying that everything or everyone within this group agrees, and this is never the case. But I do think that there are some commonalities within this larger umbrella of what I'm calling liberation theology. And today I want to discuss three of these. First, the purpose of liberation theology is to seek justice. Second, the God of liberation theology is the God of the oppressed, the God who takes the side of the oppressed. And third, the starting point of liberation theology is lived experience. Liberation theology is self-consciously contextual. All right, let's start with the first of these characteristics. Now ask yourself, what is the goal of theology? What's the purpose of theology? Why do we as Christians, as those who are part of the church, do theology? Now, this has been an important question since the Enlightenment. Many post-Enlightenment theologians try to respond to modernity by defending the faith in this age of skepticism and rationalism. They thought the most important thing for theologians to do is come up with these theories and these statements to defend the Christian faith against those who want to deny it. Well, liberation theology offers a different response to modernity. For liberation theologians, the greatest question is not how can Christians confess their faith within this context of philosophical skepticism and questioning. No, the greatest context or the greatest question and challenge for liberation theologians was how can Christians confess the faith in the midst of suffering and oppression? Listen to what the Latin American theologian Gustavo Gutierrez says. The question in Latin America will not be how to speak of God in a world come to age, but rather how to proclaim God as Father in a world that is inhumane. What can it mean to tell a non-person that he or she is God's child? For liberation theologians, theology is not primarily about what the church believes or what it thinks, but what the church does. Liberation theologians are concerned with praxis, with practice. The context of liberation theology is the question of how the church ought to respond to oppression. It's a question of justice, grounded in the lived experiences of those who suffer. So liberation theology is not primarily something that's done in the academy. No, in confronting injustice and oppression, liberation theology is an outworking of Jesus' ministry when he says, I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly. See, the fact is, many do not have life. You see, oppression and injustice undermine life. And this oppression, it can take a variety of forms. But liberation theology tries to unmask them and combat oppression, whether economic or political, social or spiritual, or all of these. Liberation theologians try to overcome this gap between belief and practice, between theology and action. See, for liberation theologians, true theology is transformational. They take up the call of the book of James, which says, religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to go after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself pure from being polluted by the world. Liberation theology rejects other forms of theology which spiritualize salvation. That is, when they make salvation this otherworldly thing, which has nothing to do with life here. No, the salvation which the gospel announces must include redemption from oppression. The second common feature of liberation theology is their vision of God. Liberation theology's vision for justice is really grounded in who God is. The God revealed in Jesus Christ is the God of the oppressed. The God revealed in Jesus Christ stands in solidarity with the marginalized and those who suffer. Jesus himself lived and ministered among those who are oppressed by these various forms of injustice. Jesus even describes his ministry in this way. The Spirit of the Lord is on me Because he has anointed me to proclaim the good news to the poor, he has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. The third common feature of liberation theology is that it's self-consciously contextual. Now, in some sense, all theology is contextual. All talk about who God is emerges from a particular context and it responds to a context. But some forms of theology kind of downplay or even deny that their thought is contextual. Now, liberation theologies don't privilege neutrality or objectivity. They recognize that all theology is contextual. In fact, they argue that theology can only be done faithfully if it's grounded in practice. So more so than other forms of theology, liberation theology is what I'm saying is it's self-consciously contextual. Liberation theology takes place then not within the academy primarily, but within the church, as the church seeks justice for the oppressed. Now, this differs among different liberation theologies. Latin American liberation theology is response to social oppression. Black theology is response to racial oppression. Feminist theology is response to gender oppression. Now, in each case, theologians are responding to oppression with the God of the gospel, with the gospel of God. They're doing theology, though, within a particular context, and they're responding to a particular context. Why is this important? Well, for liberation theologians, all theology is contextual and interested. By interested, liberation theologians mean that theology will serve the interests of someone. Theology is not neutral. For liberation theologians, this lack of neutrality means that theology will either serve those in power or those who are marginalized. There's theology of the oppressed and there's theology of the oppressor. In other words, theology can either reinforce and justify these existing oppressive structures and systems, or it can challenge and seek to reform them in favor of seeking justice. This pattern of argument, it occurs throughout these different liberation theologians that we're going to explore. So let's sum up. Liberation theology shares common characteristics that bind these different movements together. They share first a common purpose of seeking justice for the oppressed. This common purpose is driven by their understanding that the God revealed in Jesus Christ is the God of the oppressed. Finally, they focus on the importance of contextual and interested theological method. They argue that faithful theology must respond to specific contexts and lived experiences, particularly the experiences of those who suffer injustice.